The city of Manhattan sparkled like a diamond on the day Lena Carrington became Mrs. Griffin Maddox. But beneath the shimmering chandeliers and designer smiles, the truth stood cold and unyielding. A billionaire and a disgraced politician's daughter, bound not by love, but by a contract neither of them dared to unravel. Cameras flashed as the couple emerged from the cathedral. Yet not once did Griffin's icy blue eyes meet hers. His gaze remained fixed ahead, like a soldier walking to war, not a groom returning from vows. Inside the towering stone church, guests whispered behind crystal champagne flutes, speculating if the billionaire had finally fallen for a woman, or if she was just another chess piece in his empire. Griffin stood at the altar like a statue carved in arrogance, his tuxedo crisp, his jaw tight, reciting his vows with mechanical precision that sliced through the air sharper than any diamond on Lena's finger. "You'll have my name, my house, my money, but never my heart." The words dropped like frost on a blooming rose, and yet Lena didn't flinch, didn't cry, didn't even blink. She just smiled faintly, like someone who'd already learned that love wasn't something she'd be offered in this lifetime. Dressed in an ivory gown that shimmered like starlight, Lena looked like every man's dream and every woman's envy. But inside, she was nothing but quiet storms and silent prayers. A girl who once painted futures in pastel, but now signed her life away in ink. Her father, once a respected senator, now a stain on every news channel, had bartered her freedom for favor, disguising her marriage as a redemption arc for their name, while in truth, he'd simply sold her to the highest bidder. Lena didn't cry because she'd already drowned in the tears years ago, when her mother abandoned her, when the scandal broke, and when her own family taught her that survival often looks like surrender. As the ceremony ended, the couple was ushered into a black limousine, and Griffin's hand never once reached for hers. He stared out the window as if the world outside was more interesting than the woman beside him, while Lena silently counted every heartbeat between them. The drive to the Maddox estate was quiet, the air thick with tension and unspoken regrets. And when they arrived, Lena stepped into the cold marble foyer of the mansion that was now hers in title only, the grandeur echoing louder than any welcome. The staff bowed, the butler handed her a schedule, and Griffin walked past her without a word, disappearing into the East Wing as if she were nothing more than a rumor. That night, while the city hummed with celebration, their bedroom doors remained firmly shut, two strangers sleeping under the same roof, yet miles apart in spirit. Lena stared at the moon from her balcony, wondering how love could feel like exile, how a wedding could feel like mourning, and how silence could be louder than any scream. She removed her veil slowly, not as a bride disrobing for her groom, but as a woman shedding another illusion. In the hallway, Griffin paused by her door for a moment, his hand hovering over the knob, his face unreadable. But then he turned away, footsteps fading like promises never meant to be kept. Lena placed her trembling hands on the piano keys in the sitting room, pressing them softly, letting the notes mourn for her because her lips had forgotten how to. In the darkness, she whispered not to the world but to herself, "Even broken things deserve a chance to shine." And for a second, the chandelier above her flickered, as if hope, too, was listening. Somewhere deep inside the mansion, Griffin poured himself a glass of scotch, ignoring the ache in his chest, convincing himself that detachment was power and that feelings were weaknesses he'd long outgrown. But neither of them knew that something unspoken had already begun to shift. That destiny, cruel and beautiful, was already cracking the ice between them, waiting patiently for the night when distance would no longer be enough to silence what their hearts were truly screaming. The chandelier's flicker had barely faded when Lena turned from the balcony and closed her door quietly behind her. But even in solitude, the weight of unspoken words clawed at her spine like winter wind inside an empty cathedral. The mansion was grand but soulless, each hallway echoing with the same silence that clung to Griffin Maddox's every breath. By morning, he was already gone, his side of the dining table untouched, his presence replaced by black coffee and a single note that read, "Board meeting, don't wait." Lena sat alone beneath a ceiling of crystal, buttered toast untouched, wondering if she had married a man or a shadow in a tailored suit. Days bled into each other as she wandered the estate like a living question mark, her steps silent across polished marble, never daring to touch the piano again, never welcomed into the East Wing where his world remained locked behind heavy oak doors. She was forbidden from entering his study, just as she was unwelcome in his heart, a stranger in silk, admired by guests but ignored by the only man who should have seen her. Griffin was precise in his movements, disciplined like a man who trained himself to feel nothing, to breathe without emotion, to blink without curiosity. He worked late, rose early, and spoke to her only in sentences carved from stone, as if affection were a language long dead in his bloodline. But fate has a way of slipping through cracks, and one quiet evening, while dusting the library with more care than the staff ever showed, Lena's hand brushed against a drawer that gave a soft click. Inside it was a single photo, aged, fragile, and heartbreakingly familiar. A woman with the same glacier blue eyes as Griffin stared back, caught mid-laugh, her smile bright and wounded all at once. On the back, written in looping script like a whisper from the past, forgiveness was never enough. The room darkened in that moment, not from the light, but from the gravity of knowing this woman had shaped the man she now lived with yet barely knew. Lena closed the drawer, heart thudding not from fear, but the strange intimacy of discovering a man through his ghosts. She said nothing at dinner that night, though Griffin noticed something different in the way she held her fork. More hesitation, more thought, and for the first time he paused mid-sentence, almost asking, but the question died behind his pride. He observed her more after that, how she hummed softly when alone, how her hair caught the sun through the gallery window, how her hands moved with tragic elegance as she painted grief into landscapes no one else could see. She painted not to decorate, but to survive, and he watched from a distance like a man studying a fire he didn't want to extinguish, but couldn't afford to touch. Lena, in turn, noticed the small cracks in his armor, the way he stared at nothing a moment too long, the way his hand trembled ever so slightly when someone mentioned family, the way he never once looked at wedding photos placed by the housekeepers. One evening, he passed by her studio and paused, his eyes drifting to a canvas showing a woman wrapped in fog, faceless, fading. "Who is she?" he asked, voice like gravel under velvet. "Me," she said without looking up. "If I stay invisible long enough." His reply was a scoff, bitter, defensive. "Feelings are distractions. You're here for formality." But the words stung more than they silenced, and when he walked away, Lena didn't cry. She just whispered to herself, "Then why do your eyes burn every time you walk away?" The pain wasn't in what he said, but in what he couldn't say, in the emotion that tightened in his jaw, in the memories he kept behind that locked drawer, in the way his body faced forward, but his heart always seemed to hesitate. Griffin Maddox, with all his wealth and brilliance, was nothing more than a fortress, flawless on the outside, hollow within, built on the ruins of someone else's betrayal. And Lena, still learning how to breathe in the spaces he'd barricaded, wondered how long a woman could stay uninvited in a marriage without turning invisible. But even in silence, even in rooms where the air grew colder with every passing word, something was changing. Not in declarations, not in romance, but in glances that lingered 1 second too long, in footsteps that hesitated outside her studio, in the faintest ache that followed them both into bed at night, where dreams became battlegrounds and rest became a war of longing neither dared to name. The nights had grown quieter, but not gentler, each one leaving Lena wide awake in a house where even the silence seemed engineered to remind her of her place, of how far away she remained from Griffin Maddox's heart, no matter how close their room stood. So when the invitation arrived for the annual Kensington Foundation Gala, a velvet envelope engraved with legacy and power, Lena knew she'd be expected to play the wife in public, to dress like opulence and smile like everything was fine. The gown they selected for her was midnight blue, clinging like a secret, her hair swept into soft waves, her presence elegant enough to draw admiration from strangers and envy from women who had never heard her name before that night. Griffin, as always, wore confidence like armor, tuxedo tailored to perfection, posture commanding, his arm resting lightly against hers like a formality rather than affection. The ballroom pulsed with glittering conversation and violin music, the chandeliers above casting a golden glow over the elite. But none of that prepared Lena for the moment her name was softly, almost poisonously, spoken from behind. "So you're the charity case." She turned and found herself face to face with Vivian Lark, the woman every tabloid still linked to Griffin, the one who had vanished from his life but never from the whispers. Vivian was breathtaking, dangerously so. Red lips, knowing eyes, and the unmistakable air of someone who had once owned a man's soul and had no intention of letting anyone else forget it. Her smile was sharp, carved for cruelty, and she leaned in close enough for her words to slide like blades against Lena's skin. "You'll never satisfy him. He's still mine where it matters." Time slowed, and for a moment, Lena couldn't breathe. Not because she believed Vivian, but because somewhere deep inside, she feared she already knew it was true. Her lips didn't tremble, her eyes didn't water, but her heart cracked in a place she hadn't realized was still soft. She excused herself, her heels echoing against marble as she disappeared into the gallery wing of the estate, painting-covered walls surrounding her with silence far kinder than human voices. Griffin found her later, standing alone beneath a portrait of a faceless woman, her expression unreadable, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "You left early," he said flatly, but she didn't turn. "Vivian said something tonight," she replied softly, "and I need to know if it's true." His eyes narrowed, but he didn't ask what. Maybe he already knew. "She said you still belong to her, that I'll never be enough." A long silence followed, and when he finally spoke, it wasn't with denial or anger or reassurance. It was with exhaustion. "Don't fall in love with me, Lena. You'll regret it." Her breath caught, not because the words were unexpected, but because they were confirmation. Confirmation that she wasn't imagining the distance, the indifference, the ache of wanting someone who wouldn't meet her halfway. She nodded once, slowly, the quiet acceptance of a woman who'd heard worse truths but still hoped for better ones. But as she walked away from him, she didn't feel free. She felt hollow, like a question no one cared enough to answer. In her room, she stared into the mirror for a long time, removing her earrings, her makeup, her mask, layer by layer until only the bruised spirit of Lena Carrington remained. And in that stillness, a dangerous craving took root. Not for his money, not for his name, but for something far rarer, to be seen without effort, loved without question, chosen without being compared to a ghost. Her reflection stared back, not fragile but fierce, not begging but becoming. Down the hall, Griffin sat in his study, staring at a closed drawer, the photo still hidden, the name Vivian still aching like a splinter beneath his skin. He didn't love Vivian, not anymore, but he didn't know how to love Lena either. And in the space between those truths, regret began to bloom, not just in her heart, but in his. Because sometimes the real tragedy isn't loving the wrong person, it's failing to love the right one before it's too late. The next morning arrived gray and slow, with the kind of stillness that warns of approaching storms, not just in weather, but in life, in hearts, in the fragile threads holding everything together. Lena had barely touched her tea when a quiet knock echoed from the front door, and a staff member handed her a thin, elegant envelope with no return name, no signature, just her own name scrawled in a rushed, almost desperate hand. Her fingers trembled as she tore it open, expecting perhaps a formal invite or another soulless social obligation. But instead, what slid out were two documents that knocked the breath from her lungs. One a copy of their marriage certificate, and the other, a confidential agreement signed by her father and Griffin Maddox months before the wedding, complete with financial transfers, conditions, and clauses that made her stomach twist. This wasn't love. It wasn't even companionship. It was a purchase. Her name, her future, her dignity, sold like a bargaining chip to cleanse her father's political sins, with Griffin's money securing silence and influence. Her vision blurred, hands crumpling the edges of the paper, as fury surged so violently through her chest, she thought her ribs might crack. She didn't wait, didn't think. She stormed through the mansion like a flame with feet, her heels echoing against marble as she found him in the study, casually swirling scotch near the fireplace, the embodiment of calm built on calculated ruin. "You bought me," she said, her voice too quiet for how much it bled. Griffin didn't speak, didn't even raise an eyebrow, but his jaw tensed. "Don't pretend," she snapped, voice rising, holding the contract like evidence in a courtroom. "Say it! Say I was just part of your power game." The fire cracked behind him but couldn't warm the space between them. For a long, unbearable second, he said nothing. And then finally his eyes lifted to hers. Haunted, hard, but not hollow. "You weren't supposed to matter," he said, every word falling like broken glass. "But you do." That's the problem. She felt it then. The unbearable cruelty of truth mixed with tenderness. How it could shatter more than lies ever could. Her lips parted, but the breath in her lungs turned to ash. There were no more words left for betrayal. She turned and walked away before her knees gave in, the contract clutched like a weapon and a wound in one. Outside, rain slammed against the windows as thunder rolled over the horizon like fury come to life. She didn't grab a coat, didn't care, just pushed open the front doors and stepped into the storm, the downpour drenching her in seconds, hair plastered to her face, mascara bleeding like war paint. But she didn't stop walking. Through the gates, down the estate steps, into the city streets slick with memory and rage, Lena moved like a woman who had nothing left to lose. Drivers honked, strangers stared, but none of it mattered. She walked until her heels blistered and her soul pulsed with the ache of being bought, used, and broken by the very man who once pretended she was part of his world. She thought of her father, how easily he'd signed her life away to save his name, and how Griffin, cold and calculating, hadn't blinked while sealing that deal. She wasn't a bride. She was a receipt. Back at the mansion, Griffin watched the rain hit the windows and grip the fireplace mantel like a man on the edge of a cliff. He didn't chase her. Maybe he knew he didn't deserve to. But deep inside, past the arrogance and strategy, past the deals and emotional walls, something cracked. A flicker of guilt, a fracture of the man who once believed feeling nothing meant never being hurt. He didn't expect her to find the contract. He never planned for her to matter. And now he was drowning in a storm of his own design, as the only woman who ever unsettled his control disappeared into a night that screamed with judgment and sorrow. Somewhere beneath the sky's fury, Lena stopped walking only when her body gave out and she collapsed beneath the awning of a closed bookstore, rain dripping from her lashes as she stared upward, not seeking answers, but simply trying to remember who she was before two powerful men rewrote her worth in ink and silence. The rain had not stopped, but Lena's tears had run out. Now beneath the soft awning of the old bookstore, she sat curled in on herself, wet fabric clinging to her skin, exhaustion anchoring her, like the final weight on a drowning woman. Hours passed unnoticed, the world spinning, but her soul paused, until, without knowing why, her feet rose and retraced the path she had fled, back through the streets that no longer whispered power, but instead echoed with something gentler, ache, apology, awakening. By the time she reached the Maddox mansion, the lights had gone dark, the power knocked out by the merciless storm, thunder growling low like regret in the chest of the sky. She stepped inside, soaked and shivering, the marble beneath her feet now cold as bone, each breath visible in the air. The silence inside was thicker than ever, until she reached the hearth, and the flicker of firelight revealed Griffin, standing motionless in the shadows. His eyes widened at the sight of her, drenched and trembling, mascara a fading ghost on her cheeks, her dress clinging like sorrow spun in silk. For a moment, neither moved. Then, in an instinct more honest than all his past words, he stepped forward and slid his jacket from his shoulders, wrapping it gently around her like a peace offering, made not of apology, but of presence. Lena didn't speak, but the tremble in her lip told him everything she hadn't shouted. Griffin's voice, once carved from cold stone, now cracked with something raw and human. "I was afraid of needing you." Lightning lit the room for a split second, casting his face in soft conflict. Man and boy, power and vulnerability, all in one. Lena looked up, her expression weary but unflinching, and her words came out low but steady. Then stop running. It wasn't a demand. It was an invitation to stay, to surrender, to feel. The fire behind them crackled, its warmth nothing compared to the heat quietly building between two wounded souls, learning how to face one another without masks. Griffin reached for her, not with dominance, but with awe, as though touching her meant touching something fragile enough to break yet strong enough to survive. His fingers brushed her cheek, reverent and trembling, tracing the damp trail her tears had left behind. And when he kissed her, it wasn't the kiss of a man seeking conquest. It was the quiet gasp of someone who had forgotten what tenderness felt like and was suddenly drowning in it. Their lips met, not with urgency, but with understanding. Two storms colliding not to destroy, but to dissolve. In that moment, they didn't speak of love, or betrayal, or promises too late to keep. They existed only in presence, in the hush between thunder and breath, in the way her forehead rested against his, as if they'd finally found stillness inside each other. Outside, the storm began to ease, its rage spent, its fury fading into soft rain that tapped against the glass like a lullaby. Inside, Lena leaned into Griffin's arms for the first time, not out of duty, but because her body no longer recognized the wall she had built to survive him. And he, who had always measured strength by distance, now found courage in closeness. "You were the calm I never knew I needed," he whispered, lips brushing her temple, and Lena closed her eyes not to escape, but to remember the feeling of finally being chosen. Not for leverage, not for image, but for the quiet miracle of being seen. In the hush that followed Griffin's whispered confession, beneath dimming firelight, Lena stayed cradled in his arms, her heartbeat finally slowing, not because the war was over, but because someone had finally stepped onto the battlefield beside her. The mansion remained dim from the storm's wrath, but for once the shadows didn't feel suffocating. They felt honest. Griffin pulled away slightly, eyes locked to hers, and in that gaze was something unspoken. Permission to cross into parts of himself he'd walled off for years. With a breath that carried the weight of history, he reached into the drawer Lena had once found locked and pulled out the photo again. The woman with the same ice blue eyes, the same face that had haunted his silence. "She was my mother," he said, voice low but steady, as if the words had waited a decade to be born. "She left when I was 11, walked out on my father, on me, for a billionaire who promised her the world. She said she was tired of struggling, tired of loyalty to a man with broken dreams. I stopped believing in love the day she left." Lena listened, not as a wife needing an apology, but as a woman who knew what abandonment felt like in her bones. And when he finished, she placed her hand gently over his and said, "Then maybe it's time you believed in someone who stayed." For the first time, he didn't flinch. He asked about her, and she told him of the night her father demanded she lie on national television, denying everything about his backdoor dealings and laundering schemes. And when she refused, he called her an ingrate and cut her off like she was disposable. "But I didn't want to be another puppet in his circus," she whispered. "I'd rather be alone with integrity than protected by lies." They sat there, two broken heirs, one from love's betrayal, the other from family's manipulation, learning that survival didn't mean becoming colder. It meant choosing differently when given another chance. And they had. They had this chance. But fate, jealous of stillness, never stayed quiet for long. Days later, whispers reached the Maddox boardroom. Anonymous emails, leaked timelines, rumors that their marriage had been transactional, designed to fix PR optics after Griffin's controversial acquisition of a rival firm. The board saw it as a scandal, a weakness, a reason to dethrone him. Word spread fast, and an emergency meeting was called. Griffin expected blood. He prepared for it. But what he didn't expect was the sound of heels echoing down the corridor just before the vote. The room, filled with skeptical men in suits and thin smiles, turned as Lena stepped inside, wearing confidence like armor, fire burning beneath her poised exterior. Without waiting for permission, she walked to the head of the table and spoke. Not loudly, but with the kind of clarity that silences noise without raising a voice. "You're right," she said. "The beginning of this marriage wasn't about love, but what's true now matters more than what was written in ink then." They shifted in their chairs, some smirking, others intrigued. She went on, "While you questioned my presence at charity galas and press events, I was the one who restructured the public relations arm behind Griffin's name. The rebranding campaign? That was my proposal. The philanthropic initiatives that softened the press? My design. The sponsorships that redirected public focus from scandal to substance? I wrote every single pitch." Murmurs swirled like wind in the corners of the room, but she didn't pause. "I was quiet, not absent. You underestimated me because I didn't beg to be seen. But sometimes," she said, leaning in slightly, her voice now iron-wrapped in silk, "the woman you underestimated is the one rewriting your future." The golden phrase hung in the air like a verdict, like a prophecy. Even Griffin, seated behind her, could only stare, pride flickering in eyes that had once only known restraint. Lena stepped back, her work done, not needing their approval, only the truth to stand on its own. The board didn't clap. They voted, and Griffin stayed. Not because of his wealth or dominance, but because someone finally showed them what loyalty and grit looked like in human form. That night when they returned home, Griffin didn't say much. He just reached for her hand in the dark hallway, intertwined their fingers, and let silence speak where words would only dilute the depth. Lena, once sold, once silenced, had become the thunder. And in the quiet that followed, love didn't roar. It rested, steady and awake, between two people finally done hiding. The days that followed moved quietly, like dawn creeping over a long night. But for the first time in their marriage, silence no longer felt like a threat. It felt like safety. Griffin and Lena, once two fractured people orbiting the same house without warmth, had now become something unshakable. Two souls who didn't just survive betrayal, they transcended it. The mansion that had once echoed with isolation now bloomed with life. Sun filtering through windows they kept open. Music playing low in the mornings. The scent of coffee mingling with laughter, not forced, but free. They didn't need to say everything anymore. The space between words was no longer filled with fear, but with trust. Griffin no longer hid in boardrooms or behind guarded eyes. He had changed, not overnight, but through quiet choices that stacked like bricks, brick by brick, building a man who finally saw power not as control, but as compassion. The Maddox name began to shift in headlines, from ruthless tycoon to visionary reformer. In private meetings, he dissolved deals with companies that profited off exploitation. He redirected funds into women-led startups, green-lit mental health programs, and built scholarship funds for girls from families like Lena's. Girls who had been taught that silence was safer than truth. And Lena? She became more than the woman he loved. She became the woman the world needed. She launched her dream, an art therapy center nestled in the heart of the city, its walls filled with warmth, healing, and voices once buried by shame. It wasn't a flashy grand opening. There were no paparazzi, no diamond gowns. But there were women in recovery, survivors holding paintbrushes like swords, mothers smiling for the first time in months. On that day, as the ribbon was about to be cut, Lena stood in front of the building with her hands trembling, not from nerves but from disbelief that this life, this purpose was now real. And just as her voice faltered, a familiar hand found hers. Griffin stood beside her, not in tailored pride, not in practiced elegance, but in humility. He wore no tie, only a soft white shirt with rolled sleeves, and his smile wasn't the one he gave cameras. It was the one he had saved for her. He leaned down, not caring about the crowd, and kissed the back of her hand, his lips lingering with reverence. The crowd went still. Lena looked up into his eyes and saw the man he had become, not the boy raised on abandonment, not the billionaire who had once bartered affection, but the man who had let love teach him how to stay. His voice was low, but it carried across the quiet like thunder, dressed in velvet. "I married you by contract," he said, each word heavy with memory and meaning. "But I vow to love you forever by choice." There were no camera flashes, no applause, only breath caught in throats. Tears blinked back, and the undeniable pulse of something sacred shared between two people who had seen the worst in each other and still stayed. As the ribbon fell and the doors opened behind them, Lena knew her story no longer lived in shadows. She was no longer the girl sold by her father. She was no longer the bride untouched by love. She was a creator of safe spaces, a rebuilder of broken hearts. And Griffin, no longer the man with frozen eyes, was now the proof that healing doesn't come from forgetting the past, but from choosing every single day not to repeat it. They walked into the center hand in hand, past walls lined with paintings by women who had found their voices again. And somewhere in the room, a young girl laughed freely, her brush dripping with color. That laugh echoed like a promise that the legacy they were building wouldn't be power or money or control, but hope. Because when love replaces fear, miracles aren't just possible, they become the truth.